Open verification. Eyal Weizmann. More than a decade ago, I would have found the idea of a forensic institute to be rather abhorrent. Coming from the field of left activism and critical spatial practice, I felt instinctively oriented against the authority of established truths. Forensics relies on technical expertise in normative and legal frameworks and smacks full of institutional authority. It is, after all, one of the fundamental arts of the state, the privilege of its agencies, the police, the secret services, or the military. Today, counterintuitively perhaps, I find myself running forensic architecture, a group of architects, filmmakers, coders, and journalists which operates as a forensic agency and makes evidence public in different forums such as the media, courts, truth commissions, and cultural venues. This reorientation of my thought practice was a response to changes in the texture of our present and to the nature of contemporary conflict. An evolving information and media environment enables authoritarian states to manipulate and distort facts about their crimes, but it also offers new techniques with which civil society groups can invert the forensic gaze and monitor them. This is what we call counterforensics. We do not yet have a satisfactory name for the new reactionary forces, a combination of digital racism, ultranationalism, self-victimhood, and conspiracism that have taken hold across the world and become manifest in countries such as Russia, Poland, Hungary, Britain, Italy, Brazil, the US, and Israel, where I most closely experienced them. These forces have made the obscuring, blurring, manipulation, and distortion of facts their trademark. Whatever form of reality denial post-truth is, it is not simply about lying. Lying in politics is sometimes necessary. Deception, after all, has always been part of the toolbox of statecraft, and there might not be more of it now than in previous times. The defining characteristics of our era might thus not be an extraordinary dissemination of untruths, but rather, ongoing attacks against the institutional authorities that buttress facts, government experts, universities, science, laboratories, mainstream media, and the judiciary. Because questioning the authority of state institutions is also what counterforensics is about, we seek to expose police and military cover ups, government lies, and instances in which the legal system has been aligned against state victims. We must distinguish it from the tactics of those political forces mentioned above. Dark epistemology. While post truth is a seemingly new phenomenon, for those working to expose state crimes at the frontiers of contemporary conflicts, it has long been the constant condition of our work. As a set of operations, this form of denial compounds the traditional roles of propaganda and censorship. It is propaganda because it is concerned with statements released by states to affect the thoughts and conducts of publics. It is not the traditional form of propaganda, though, framed in the context of a confrontation between blocs and ideologies. It does not aim to persuade or tell you anything, nor does it seek to promote the assumed merits of one system over the other, equality versus freedom or East versus West, but rather to blur perception so that nobody knows what is real anymore. Point 3. The aim is that when people no longer know what to think, how to establish facts, or when to trust them, those in power can fill this void by whatever they want to fill it with. Post-truth also functions as a new form of censorship because it blocks one's ability to evaluate and debate facts. In the face of government's increasing difficulties in cutting data out of circulation and in suppressing political discourse, it adds rather than subtracts, augmenting the level of noise in a deliberate maneuver to divert attention. One of the origins of this strategy lies in big tobacco manufacturers. In the 1970s, as the denial of health risks associated with smoking was becoming untenable in the face of mounting scientific evidence of tobacco's carcinogenic effects, manufacturers created a smoke screen of confusion and doubt. Tobacco-funded research groups started releasing a dizzying amount of counter-studies in a scattershot approach that tried to discredit scientific work and mobilize a narrative of distrust without ever offering a coherent narrative in its place. The negationism of post-truth is not an epistemological argument about facts and how best to establish them, but an attempt to cast doubt over the very possibility of there being any way to reliably establish them at all. It is, in the words of several commentators, a dark epistemology seeking to mask rather than reveal information. The strategy of dark epistemologists might seem like a new feature in the political landscape, but it is similar to that of the fascists of old, with their inclination for the negation of historical facts of past genocides and present persecutions, which are often connected. The arch-negationist Robert Forison rejected historical accounts of the Holocaust by finding and amplifying minor inconsistencies in historical documents, a feature of all archival records, to create what he hoped would become a generalized doubt about whether it happened at all. Philosopher Jean-François Lyotard referred to this negation as an earthquake so strong that it destroys not only the environment, the ground, buildings or roads, but the instruments designed to record its existence and magnitude. Point 6 Authoritarian and totalitarian regimes have an inherent fear of facts because they seek to harness a disordered reality into simplified perceptual frames. Negation is a particular kind of rhetorical act. It is not only an intervention into the field of political representation, but is entangled with the very violations it seeks to mask. Just like hate speech, it is an act of violence in itself, and the precondition for it to continue. When nothing has happened, or when crimes are not recognized as wrong, violence can be continuously perpetrated. The political art of dark epistemology has always manifested itself is at the frontiers of contemporary conflicts. In Israel, for instance, the official and recently state-sanctioned negation of the Nakba, the ongoing expulsion of Palestinians from areas controlled by Israel starting 1948, is the foundation for the almost daily negations of its present violence and human rights violations throughout Palestine. Dark epistemology has also military roots where it has developed its own operational theories. Western militaries prefer the terms psychological operations, psyops, or cognitive maneuvering when describing a campaign for broadcasting misleading and contradictory information to influence people's conception of reality, emotions, motives, and behavior. Under the labels of perception management or desinformatia, Russia and its supporters have weaponized information of the battlefield, inventing a paranoid, conspiratorial, and hallucinatory reality to divert public attention away from its actions in Syria and Ukraine. In this context, the state violence is aimed at two things: people and things, and the evidence that violence has taken place at all. Perception management in the age of personal media and the internet has become a huge industry, employing troll farms and bot armies. James Harkin of the Center for Investigative Journalism aptly warned that the next World War might begin with a grainy, contested image launched online from some distant and inaccessible outpost. The reason people in Western countries have become aware of dark epistemology is because these battlefield techniques of conflict management have only recently beached like a carcass onto the shores of mainstream Western politics. Thus, what every human rights activist has been aware of for many years has become visible and marked as the new phenomenon of post-truth. Some suggest that current attacks against truth have the flair of liberal or libertarian minority rights and identity politics, or the left philosophy of post-structuralism, which identifies established truths, science, Enlightenment values, and common sense as the product of power relations and as a means of domination. Indeed, some promoters of dark epistemology have referred in passing to the cultural heroes of post-structuralism, something that led, here and there, people to blame post-structuralism for these ills of our present. I think, however, that in resisting dark epistemology, we need to do something more subtle than either turn our rage against deconstruction or revert to a known position of last resort, defending the positivism of old with its established guardians of power/knowledge. Rather, a critical approach is essential for the two main things counterforensics needs to do: deconstructing false statements made by officials and reconstructing something of the truth of what has happened. Post structuralism's culture of suspicion is essential in exposing the gaps, inconsistencies, biases, traces of manipulation, and misrepresentations in the statements of those in power or in places where the habit of trust might otherwise compel us to see facts. A critical approach is essential to understand the circumstances and modes by which official statements are made and to find inconsistencies and lacunae within them. But such a critical approach can also have a constructive function. When we understand how facts are made, where their weaknesses lie, and what are the limits of what can be said, we can better construct and defend them. Polyperspectivity. The attacks on traditional institutions and expertise that have so often been made in the context of the current nationalist, racist insurgency have never provided the basis for the production of counter-hegemonic knowledge. Instead of rejecting the current challenges to institutional authority and expertise, the moment of post-truth could give rise to an alternative set of truth practices that can challenge both the dark epistemology of the present as well as traditional notions of truth production. It might be altogether necessary to employ the word truth differently. In opposition to the single perspectival, a priori, sometimes transcendent conception of truth embodied by the Latin word veritas, which connotes the authority of an expert working within a well-established discipline, a term more suitable to our work and of the same root is verification. Verification relates to truth not as a noun or as an essence, but as a practice, one that is contingent, collective, and polyperspectival. The term verification could itself be associated with scientific authority. It originally belongs to the theory of science. It charges empirical observation with the task of confirming or falsifying an abstract proposition, be it a mathematical model, scientific theory, or philosophical conjecture. In the field of journalism, verification confirms or falsifies the statements of governments, politicians, corporate spokespersons, and the like. But it could also be opened up to engage with new kinds of material, open source and activist produced, and employ different methodological processes that open and socialize the production of evidence, integrate scientific with aesthetic sensibilities, and work across and bring together different types of seemingly incompatible institutions and forms of knowledge. The texture of the present is defined by a groundswell of online data which is full of raw information, but also disinformation, noise, bias, and distortion. Open source investigations fish in these seas. Its methods deal with the collection and analysis of material found online or in other publicly available sources, and can sometimes also include content that is leaked or obtained by freedom of information requests. They are loosely based on the culture of open source code, where work is undertaken in a diffuse manner and contributed to by a network of like-minded practitioners using the Internet. The CIA policy of extraordinary rendition, for example, was exposed by open source investigators who collected and connected seemingly mundane bits of information, private jet flight paths and receipts and addresses from places like Latvia, Romania, and Djibouti. Similarly, covert Russian military presence in Ukraine was exposed by local and remote citizen investigators working together, filming, collecting, corroborating, geolocating, and cross-referencing material that connected the dots and confirmed the Russian military's presence on the ground. Midnight. The first stage in the process of open source investigation is determining the authenticity and provenance of contested documents. While verification refers to an event, authentication refers to a single piece of evidence, say, a video or audio file, and establishes whether it has been tampered with. This is an essential in the era of deepfakes, when image manipulation technologies outpace technologies of detection. Authentication has both vertical and horizontal dimensions. The vertical dimension is concerned with deep investigation of the file in question. The composition of compressed pixels could testify for tampering. Horizontal authentication is based on establishing lateral relations between scattered evidentiary sources. When an incident or accident takes place, multiple videos are often shot simultaneously by different people in different locations, each one offering a different perspective and focus. Not all found videos appear important or relevant at first glance, but they might contain information or provide important links, like connectors or time anchors, between other videos. Patiently adding different local, ground level perspectives to one another allows us to investigate incidents from different points of view. Most users point their cameras in the direction of the destruction and its victims, yet some know to seek with their cameras the perpetrators, capturing insignia, weapons, vehicles, or aircrafts. The more perspectives, the more relations can be established between the actors, perpetrators, victims, and bystanders in a scene. When videos can be linked to each other, the risk of an inauthentic video is also reduced. Point 13. When a video is authentic, it will more easily link with others, whereas a fake video will often remain an outlier. At Forensic Architecture, we use 3D models as dynamic digital environments to locate cameras and other media artifacts. Because most videos and images found online are without metadata, they need to be geolocated within what we call operative models. These models also allows for the time of the image to be determined by simulating shadows and matching them with those captured in images, or by mapping the movement of clouds. Within these models, the camera's cone of vision is inverted. Images and videos are projected outwards from the camera until the features of the image match the massing details of the model. Once the calibration of one image or video into the model has been achieved, other sources can be matched more accurately. The more videos or images within the model, the more complete our view of the event is. The operative model then allows investigators to spatially and temporally move between image and video sources. The way of handling and viewing moving images is thus one of spatial navigation, rather than the traditional approach of splice and edit. Open source investigators are sometimes accused of being remote from the subject of their analysis. But personal cameras and the internet bring investigators to experience events from the perspective of witnesses who have immediate access to events. Many people documenting atrocities do so at the risk of their lives. They find ways to film and upload material when doing so can get them shot, and when authoritarian regimes make entire areas electronically inaccessible. However, the fact that not all places are equally networked is a limit to open source investigations, whose attention could tend to gravitate towards the places most documented. Furthermore, the absence of videos could itself be evidence for violations. Internet shutdowns often correlate with state violations, as the currently escalating situation in Sudan demonstrates. Cameras could be seized by police and militaries, journalists targeted, and online data removed. In such situations, testimonies of witnesses and material traces are the only available resource. Open verification must therefore collapse the distance of open source analysis with the proximity of direct engagement with communities on the ground, and establish personal contact with the people and communities exposed to violence. Forensic architecture has over the years developed methods of analysis that includes interviewing witnesses within virtual models, helping some retrieve lost memories. Point 15. The analog dimensions of open verification include site visits and material analysis. But importantly, it also requires the establishing of contact, remote or proximate, with witnesses who experience the violence firsthand. Local perspectives can then be brought together with scientific expertise such as blast, fire, or fluid dynamics, or in the case of environmental issues, remote sensing, botany, and geology. Open verification shifts back and forth between close ups and extremely long shots, moving transversely and laterally between different source points, perspectives, and worldviews. It relies upon the creation of a community of practice in which the production of an investigation is socialized, a relation between people who experience violence, activists who take their side, a diffuse network of open source investigators, scientists, and other experts who explore what happened. The presentation of evidence must also be socialized with lawyers, journalists, and sometimes, in our case, cultural institutions that help fund, produce, and present the work. As such, the open process of the investigation establishes a social contract that includes all the participants in the uncanny assemblage of production and dissemination. Every case produced with open verification is thus not only evidence of what has happened, but also evidence of the social relations which made it possible. Our investigation into the murder of Yaqub Musa Abu al-Chian in the village of al-Hiron in the Nakab/Nejaf, for instance, was carried out in collaboration with the residents of the village, activists on the ground such as active stills videographers, Palestinian politicians who were present in solidarity, alternative and mainstream media organizations, human rights lawyers, and even a retired policeman that was happy to share of detail of police process. It was the variety and strength of this network that ultimately led state officials to retract their narrative that Abu al-Chian was a terrorist. Open verification has less access to the privilege of institutionalized truth practices, whose claims are often backed only by the authority of their respectable facades, which can hide the hard and messy work of case construction. We can never take trust for granted. While the probity of traditional expert testimony, when presented outside of scientific forums and to the general public, lies in the credentials and reputation of scientists or their institutions, the probity of open verification must be in its making. The burden of open verification is to gain trust and keep as open and transparent as possible the processes by which truth claims are made and facts established. Open verification needs to continuously expose every step by which the work was carried out, its circumstances, the people involved, the materials used, how and where each piece of evidentiary material was found, its modes of authentication, the ways by which different pieces of evidence were brought together, and a case was assembled. Doing this allows for the public domain to function in an analogous process to a scientific peer review, that is, for the underlying data to be examined by others, and the processes to be replicated and tested. This is the reason that most of the content of our video investigations is a how to. The presentation of a case thus always needs to record the interaction and interference that were part of its process. This openness is necessary because, unlike medical or DNA experts, the basic building blocks of these cases, images, videos, material remains, or testimonies, and how they are assembled, must also be understood by non experts. Following the root of the word in the Latin forum, forensics is about making evidence public, and thus political. Beyond the exposure of our methods and the amount of information woven together, open verification must be persuasive through the force of its narrative, the momentum of its collectivity, and the rhetoric of its presentation in image, video, text, and sound. To make a change, it needs to be mobilized as part of a social political process, and for this, social alliances need to be built. Contaminated knowledge. Dark epistemologists do not only attack the old state institutions of authority but also organizations like ours who expose the powers they seek to protect. They do it by targeting precisely what makes open verification possible, its composed and network dimension. A single video showing a perpetrator and its victim in the same frame is always going to be more convincing than the synchronization of a dozen or more videos and their composition into a 3D model. While for us the strength of evidence is the degree to which it is composed and its different elements support each other, it is precisely this complexity of composition that is attacked by those whose actions we intend to incriminate. They act as if each individual piece of evidence must in itself be proof of the crime as a whole. The more steps a source material is taken through, the more varied the sources in the mix and people involved, the more those accused. Crime manipulation, fabrication, aestheticization. Every defense lawyer will always seek to find weak links in the evidence against their client, but here it seems that what is being targeted is the very idea that evidence requires different elements and the synchronized work of multiple practitioners. Given the collaborative and composite nature of open verification, denialist organizations have adopted other tactics to work against it. Sometimes it involves scanning through the diffuse network necessary to produce facts to identify what might be referred to as the contaminating factor. The contaminating factor could be human or not, a person, an organization, a political affiliation, a video, or even a funder whose identity might be vulnerable to attack. Denialists then claim that by association, the entire network and the information it produces is tainted and meaningless. In 2016, we investigated Russian Air Force strikes on an MSF, Doctors Without Borders, supported hospital in Syria. The case was carried out by combining testimony from Syrian civilians and physicians at the scene, synchronizing and locating multiple videos shot by the first responders of the White Helmets, and corroborating these with recorded sightings of Russian fighter jets taking off and landing just before and after the attack, as well as with statements made by the Russian Air Force. In response to the publication of our findings, RT, one of Russia's main English-speaking, state-sponsored media, i.e. propaganda, channels, attacked our analysis by stating that using material uploaded by the White Helmets, which they claimed were elsewhere involved in providing medical aid to terrorists, and the West-funded Syrian Observatory, made our claims worthless. But open verification considers all available sources, including those of the belligerents themselves, acknowledging the partial and often tendential ways in which it was recorded and disseminated, and after authenticating each piece of evidence, engages in composing them together to see if a story emerges. The more perspectives, the better, obviously, but the more they come from different and antagonistic sources, the better too. Our attitude to evidence is respect and suspect, and our guiding questions are, is it authentic? And does it link up? Also in 2016, we investigated the Syrian government's most notorious prison of Saidnaya with Amnesty International. We cross-referenced the testimony of 5 of its survivors by virtually placing them within an architectural and acoustic model of the prison. The investigation was widely disseminated and led to general condemnation of the regime. Pressed about the result of this investigation, President Assad falsely claimed it was funded by Qatar to smear the Syrian government. Others go after our OSF funding, the often vilified organization founded by George Soros. No funder has any say over our selection of cases or fines. Other contaminating factors could be the images themselves. Perpetrators often claim that image quality is too raw, grainy, blurry, or shaky to conclusively show they violated human rights. Israel makes U.S. satellite providers degrade the resolution of available images over the country and its occupied territories, where most of its violations occur, and then often claims that satellite surveys of the destruction it brings about in Gaza are unverifiable. At other times, the designation of an investigation as an artwork functions as the contaminating factor. When we published our investigation that called into question the testimony of a German Secret Service Verfassungsschutz agent who claimed he did not witness a neo-Nazi murder in 2006 despite being present at the crime scene during the incident, members of the Christian Democratic Party (CDU) in charge of the Verfassungsschutz applied a similar negationist tactic. Looking through the bios of our team members, they picked those of us who graduated from art schools and, together with the fact that the investigation was shown in Documenta 14, claimed that we were merely artists and thus unqualified to produce evidence. Aesthetic Commons. Rather than putting aesthetics in a separate place or even in opposition to knowledge production, we need to find new ways of aligning them. As the capacity to sense and detect, aesthetics has an obvious evidentiary dimension. It is also essential as the mode and means for narration, performance, and staging necessary for making evidence public. And it is evident that, when it is mainly images and videos that need to be examined, image producers, photographers, and filmmakers have a crucial role to play. Exhibitions in art and cultural venues could act as forums complementary, and sometimes even alternative to legal process. This is particularly necessary when evidence of the kind we produce is not admitted to court, or when juridical processes function like rabbit holes, disappearing cases for years. The presentation of the NSU investigation in Documenta was in fact useful in making public its results. Being seen by hundreds of thousands of people led to the work's invitation to a German parliamentary commission of inquiry where Andreas Stem, the Secret Service agent whose testimony we found to be a lie, was required, despite his protests and that of the CDU delegation, to watch and respond to a screening of the artwork. Indeed, as this case taught us, integrating cultural and aesthetic practices within the investigative process could contribute to changes in the role of both art and law. We both use cultural institutions as forensic forums and act curatorially and performatively within legal ones. Collaborations with cultural and art venues are useful in other ways too. Museums and biennales have helped produce new work. For example, the follow-up investigation to the NSU case concerning police involvement in the killing of the anti-fascist rapper Pavlos Fyssas by Golden Dawn members in Athens was co-produced by BAK, Basis voor Actual Kunst, in Utrecht. Our ability to return to and open up the case of the Israeli police killing of Yaqub al-Chian and its cover-up was made possible with the budget provided for an exhibition at Tate Britain. It is ironic to notice how, as the art of lying spreads through institutions of power, the craft of truth must find its place in the museum. Collaborating with art and cultural venues is not only a pragmatic move. Both forensics and curatorial practices share a deep concern for knowledge production and display, for the presentation of ideas and issues through the arrangements of evidence, objects, conversations, screenings, or bodies in space. On one recent occasion, our work in the domain of art and in that of human rights were brought together. Late in 2018, it became known that the tear gas canisters used by the Israeli army against protesters in Palestine and by U.S. agencies against both protesters in Ferguson and migrants in Tijuana-San Diego border were manufactured by a company owned by Warren B. Kanders, the vice chair of the board of trustees of the Whitney Museum of American Art. The museum invited us to take part in the 2019 iteration of its Biennale. This required a different approach, and our work, Triple Chaser, with Laura Poitras, presented an investigation of Canders's weapon business at the Whitney, and even led to the issuing of a legal notice against him. The meshing of legal, scientific, and aesthetic practice has a long history. A close entanglement of visual art, architecture, and science can be traced back to early modern Europe. In the 16th century, knowledge about nature was produced by practitioners who occupied a liminal space between science and art. The European art academies of the following century provided artists with access to experts on anatomy and the techniques of linear perspective and anamorphic projection. But gradually, the shared epistemology and aesthetics of facts started diverging into separate subjects and specialisms, such that by the 19th century the domains of science and art were positioned in opposition to one another. The scientific virtue of objectivity has purportedly become unresolvable with the aesthetic virtue of subjectivity. While a scientist was asked to restrain all individual, situated, and unique traits or character, an artist was required to augment them. Objectivity aspired to be, in the words of Lorraine Doston and Peter Galeisen, a form of knowledge that bears no trace of the knower. In keeping with this reductive separation, it was these traces of the knower that were precisely what our critics would refer to as contamination. But for us, situatedness is the defining feature of the very notion of evidence. Today, this gulf between science and art must close again. The practice of open verification is one of the avenues through which to re-entangle artistic and scientific work and bring forth a new aesthetic of facts. Rather than objectivity's view from nowhere, open verification seeks the meshing of multiple, subjective, located, and situated perspectives. Rather than being confined to the black boxes of institutions of authority, it is based on open processes and new alignments between different sites and institutions of diverse types and standings: the science laboratory, the artist studio, the university, activist organizations, victim groups, national and international legal forums, the media, and cultural institutions. So while there might seem to be an apparent, superficial link between post-truth and our practice of counter-forensics, both approaches question statements made by government agencies like the police, intelligence services, and the court. There is also a crucial difference. We respond to the current skepticism towards expertise not with resignation or a relativism of anything goes, but with a more vital and risky form of truth production, based on establishing an expanded assemblage of practices that incorporate aesthetic and scientific sensibilities and includes both new and traditional institutions. State perpetrators and dark epistemologists want to destroy the possibility of a common ground. And so, without a state to protect and guide us, establishing the common ground becomes a political project. With each new investigation, a new community of praxis is woven from the meshing of its divergent viewpoints. In this, open verification becomes a form of construction. In socializing the production and dissemination of evidence, it ultimately establishes an unlikely but fundamental commons in which the production facts constitute the foundation of an expanded epistemic community of practice built around a shared perception and understanding of the world. The struggle for a common ground is an essential meta-political condition, a precondition for any political initiative and struggle to take place. These commons might seem analogous to a natural resource such as air or a fresh water, and as such we must protect it when it is polluted by the toxins of dark epistemologists. Yet unlike water and air, it is neither pre-existing nor natural, but a social reality that needs to be continuously remade, reinforced and fought over. It must not be fenced off, but kept with its margins open to new information and ever newer perspectives, evidence, and interpretation. As such, it can only grow and morph with disagreement.